Hello everyone, welcome back. Hopefully you enjoyed that little story about James Armistead Lafayette because it's a good story on how us as black folks have supported this American cause from the beginning, this little old experiment that we call America. But after every single war, man, we've always had to still fight for our freedom, okay? But the underpinnings of that led to, I gotta stop this. Okay, take two. Hey, welcome back. Hopefully you enjoyed that story, and we'll have more stories coming like that in the future. But I brought that story to you to talk to you about the American Revolution and how it really its basis is on economic freedom, not on the fact that, no taxation without representation. I mean, it's a good slogan, but it's just part of what is the myth of America, right? Now, that being said, as a child, I was taught that back in December 16th, 1973, December, I'm saying my birth year. Let's start that over because I ain't got to mess up on that. Okay, stop, reset, start. Take 3. Welcome back. Hopefully you enjoyed that story about James Armistead Lafayette. It's a wonderful story about how us as Native Black Americans always have given ourselves to this American experiment and not have received the same love in return. But let's put that to the side. Here's the deal. The American Revolution was actually an economic revolution. All about economic freedom, not about people throwing tea into water, right? Not about really no taxation without representation. So I was taught from being a little bitty kid that back December 16th, 1773, colonists not happy about being taxed, the 1773 Tax Act, they weren't happy about that. So since they had that tax and they wasn't being represented and being taxed without representation, they decided to all board a boat or 3 boats. Now, they disguised themselves as Native Americans or as Indians, as it would say, and they decided to throw a bunch of tea into the water. I think it was like 342 cases or buckets or whatever it was of tea across 3 different ships. The British East India Company was the folks that suffered that problem. Now, even though we kind of want to dream that dream, historians don't always give us all of the facts that we need to be aware of. And I want you to just take a step back for a moment and just look at it from a different perspective, right? They were serving the crown. Colonists were serving the crown. And that makes complete sense. The British obviously helped the Americans out in many, many ways, and that is to go without saying, okay? But here's the problem. The British were actually on the verge of a financial crisis, okay? They had a combination of a commodity that was helping to make some money. They were kind of inching toward imperialism in India. They had a sweet treat that they got out of the West Indies, and then they had this other commodity of slavery, right? And all these things has some, being built on the back of slaves to some degree, either slaves that they have some direct ownership with or indirectly, right? So what is that commodity? What are those commodities? Those commodities are tea, sugar, slaves, later on opium, right? So when it comes to tea, the crown, British folks, Europeans in general, had this wonderful love for tea. They got a taste of tea, it's bitter. You know what? We still love it though. The addition of sugar, so Spanish and Portuguese actually brought the whole sugar thing to the game. Once they did that, that turned tea into a whole different thing, right? And so really the British East India Company was actually going and trading with China. But China didn't want to trade anything with them in particular except for give them their goods, but they weren't buying anything in return. So they had to find ways to offset those goods in other places. And one of the major places where they offset tea to was to the American colonists, right? The American colonists took a big brunt of that. But when it comes down to it, they was also getting textiles from India that ultimately turned into them getting opium, but not in the 1770s. That's more like 1800s, like 1790, somewhere after that, right? Where that became a big deal. So we'll put that to the side for a moment. But they already been importing slaves because they would go to the coast and the East India Company was actually trading slaves, right? For other things like textiles and other things that existed that they were trading for. And they would bring slaves as well as these other commodities over to the American colonies. Well, the British East India Company had some financial troubles. And in having financial troubles, the Crown was going to do things to help them out, because what happened is that these private companies really were supporting the interests of the country, okay? So now the British Parliament was going to get them out of trouble. And over the years, beginning in the 1750s, they were getting them out of trouble by instituting different acts, okay? Somewhere early on in the 1960s, 1963, they actually had, 1763, they actually had the Trade Restrictions Act, where they cut off trading partners for the colonists, right? So now that means that these colonists that have rice, tobacco, indigo can't trade these different things to other people around the world because the British were cutting that off, right? Or at least taxing it, right? And then you have the Currency Act, where they wouldn't actually allow the actual colonists to create their own currency. Another problem. After that, the Stamp Act, where they started taxing any printed goods. And then after that, it was the Townshend Acts, where they taxed essential stuff, including tea, okay? Then there was the 1770 actually Boston Massacre that occurred. And then after that, you got the actual 1773 Tea Act that actually lowered the price of tea so they can try to create a monopoly, but also tax things tremendously. So the Americans are getting taxed all over the place. And what you're doing is you're peeling away the financial freedoms that they're gaining, because the Southerners, the Southern states in particular, are making a lot of money from having free labor, okay, and being able to have these labor-intensive things like rice, tobacco, cotton, indigo being grown and being able to trade those with other people, right? They're making money, right? And so now what they're doing is they're finding every single way to tax these colonists, right? So I understand a statement. No taxation without representation. But they didn't really want representation. They didn't really care about representation, because all representation was going to do was still get them taxed. So you had this thing brewing over the years, and then ultimately the Americans created a Declaration of Independence, and in 1776 decided to move forward and take things in a direction that they needed to. But understand something that is true about all that. The British economy was based on slavery. Them getting tea is one thing. That tea, likely because they were trading Africans, was on the back of slaves or indentured servants at a minimum. Now, the reason why I say that is because they were taking Africans to China. They were taking Africans to India. They were taking Africans to the Americas, to the West Indies, because they were a good commodity to trade. Not to mention, in trading that commodity, you could also use that commodity to help you build your economy. So they were being traded for goods. The American, the colonists, their economy, the rice, the tobacco, the indigo. There were slaves that were actually doing all that work. In the West Indies, You absolutely know that the sugar cane, there were slaves, right? So in every aspect of these economies, right? If you look at what would later happen in terms of the opium trade, well, this British East Company was taking opium from India, Bengal, and actually sending that over to China, right? And so China actually banned it completely. And once they banned it, then they would take that same opium and sell it to smaller traders who would get it into China in a different way. But there was a famine caused in Bengal, and part of it was due to the need of trying to build out this economy for Great Britain. So realistically, between the Americas, the West Indies, the British, all of their economies was based on the backs of slaves. Slaves actually doing the work for the goods that were going to be sold or being traded directly for financial gains. It wasn't until the 1830s that the British decide, hey, this is not such a good thing. Matter of fact, I would almost say to you that we might have been free sooner if the British Crown would have kept hold of the Americas. Because at least by the 1830s, at least 20, 25 years, 30 years prior to our actual emancipation, they would have outlawed slavery, and then we would have gained from that. But even prior to that, don't get it twisted. There's always been Africans, native blacks, that have fought for their freedom. In Massachusetts back in, I believe, 1773, there were blacks that petitioned the government of Massachusetts for their freedom, and I believe actually got that freedom, but the governor of Massachusetts vetoed it and made sure that it didn't happen. So there's many, many cases, even where you have some popular names like a Prince Hall of Masonic fandom, who was a part of trying to make sure that these native blacks, these Africans, actually receive just due and gain their freedoms, because guess what? They're hearing about these things. They're hearing about being free, and about, the Americans wanting to have this opportunity, right? So we've always fought for our freedom. Don't think that hasn't been the case. But don't think that the American Revolution was really over tea. It was not. The American Revolution happened as an all about economic freedoms, because the colonists needed to have economic freedom away from the British Crown. Thanks for visiting the shop. There's absolutely no me without you. But before you walk out that door, make sure you visit us at Endangered Species Unapologetically.com. You will find ways to stay connected with us. Take a look at our show notes of the episodes, bonus material, as well as that merchandise that Hustle Man got over there in the corner. When you're ready to break those chains, we got some stuff there for you to make your life better. However, as the old folks would say, be safe out there, young blood. See you next week.